So, welcome to Purple Go Podcast.
You're not on the podcast. If you want to be in.
Right. Hello and welcome to the Purple Goat Podcast. This episode is hosted by me, Luke.
And myself, Josie.
And we are here in our segment to debate the questions around inclusive and accessible design. Today's question is, what do we mean by inclusive design? So I think from my perspective, inclusive design means a lot of things. When we think about inclusive design, it's about, I think at its most general level, it's making sure that products, services, media, all things are created and implemented in a way that allows people to interact with them. All people, including, at Purple Goat, the main consideration that we're taking into account is the disabled community. Quite often in the past, when we think about product design, user experience, people with disabilities haven't been thought about or included in the inclusive design process, or they've been included as an afterthought, and that has led to disabled people being excluded from certain things as a result. I'm interested to see if there's anything you want to add to that, Josie?
I mean, when you say include, I know you talk about accessibility. Is that all it takes to be inclusive, in your opinion? When you talk about inclusive design and you were to give someone tips in how to be inclusive in their design, is accessibility the only thing they need to consider?
No, I don't think so at all. I think inclusive design, again, and that's why I think I think that's where we're saying and starting with this idea that it means a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different facets to what inclusivity and accessibility mean more generally. So when I talk about accessibility, I'm talking about it in terms of disability, thinking about the disabled community, because that's the community that I work with. And for me, that's my particular area of expertise, and that's where I can give advice on.
Yeah.
But inclusivity doesn't stop there. Inclusivity can mean considering other marginalised communities as well, and making sure that they are also included in steps within the design process. And that doesn't just come down to usability as well. That comes down to other things such as representation. Inclusive design is a very cooperative process as well. It's not top down, one person making all the decisions. Quite often, I often think, is that inclusive design is about working with a community as well. Which again, going back to what we do at Purple Goat, we're always making sure that we're working with the disabled community, with the things that we make, the things that we design. We have members of the disabled community on our team as well. And through that, it means that we're able to not design from a top-down, non-disabled, imposing something on the disabled community. It's about a back and forth process between everyone to make sure that there are solutions that are right for everyone.
And I know you've just spoken about the community, but we know how big that community is. Like we know that everyone in that community has different needs.
Yeah.
How do you become inclusive to all of those needs, and is it possible?
So this is a very interesting question, I think, because the way I always try and think of it is that inclusive design can never be 100% inclusive within a single solution. And what I mean by that is that within the disabled community, but wider as well, more broadly, when we're thinking about non-disabled people, other communities as well, people have different needs, and different needs contradict each other. An example I always like to think of is colour contrast. When we're talking about colour contrast, you've probably heard me talk a lot about colour contrast.
Yeah, you don't shut up about it.
I don't shut up about it, do I? But we need to make sure that everything that we do has adequate colour contrast, which basically means making sure that the colours aren't the same tone. There's a light colour, there's a dark colour, so the information is visible against the background.
I've had this lecture.
So when we're thinking about colour contrast, we need to make sure that colour contrast is adequate, because the visually impaired community, for instance, they need adequate color contrast because there might be some legibility issues if it's too low. However, at the same time, pure black on pure white can be argued as almost too contrasting as well, because that's two very, what we could, saturated colors. They're very bright in their own way. Even if we think of pure black as like quite a dark color, there's a lot, it's very, like, it's not very gray, it's full black, and that means it's very saturated. And when you have two very saturated colors together as well, that means that it could be almost too contrasting, and it can be visually overwhelming, such as for the neurodivergent community. And with color contrast, it's almost a more simple solution, as it were, in that you make sure that you have adequate color contrast, but not so much that it's overwhelming. And we saw this with the disability pride flag. The old disability pride flag used to have very bright, highly saturated colors on a black background, but then it was changed to be paler, less saturated colours on a mid-grey background. And what that meant was that it created a solution that was more inclusive for the community it was representing.
That's cool, I didn't know that.
But and that's a simple solution for colour contrast, but it's often not quite that simple as well. Like, sometimes there are things that are direct contradictions within a design. And that's why I always like to think that when it comes to design, the best solution is to come up with more than one solution for something, as it were. So instead of creating one size fits all as a solution, you create a suite of solutions which allow a multitude of people to be able to interact with something with ways that correspond to how they find it easiest to interact with something. So one question I had, Josie, I was just wondering what you thought about this, was the idea of, because at Purple Go, we're involved with brands, we're involved in marketing, and a lot of what I've said is very theoretical, but you deal a lot with the practical, you're the strategist here. When it comes to brands and working with brands and clients, do you think that they lose out on money by having inaccessible design?
I think absolutely. I think often enough when we at Purple Go talking to clients, we often talk about the purple pound, and in the UK I think it's £274 billion, and that's how much families in the UK spend a year. And that's money that brands are losing out on. I mean, obviously when we talk about design, it of course matters who your target audience is, but quite often we've got to remember that 22% of the population is disabled. Quite a fair amount of them is going to require accessibility requirements, and that needs to be considered in your product offerings, in your design, in your socials, in your website. Accessibility needs to be considered at every point of the business. And if it's not, that's when you're going to run into trouble and potentially, like Luke, you pointed out, lose money. I think it's an interesting point to talk about targeting, because obviously design features so much into that. And I think beyond accessibility, even if, like, in my opinion, if you look at typography, colours, other elements of design, I would say that they resonate with a certain amount of people. And you, like, if you're, quite often we see, like, women's brands, so like even women's razors, they're all pink because that's the colour is seen to like resonate with women. So it's really interesting to see how brands design their products, design their marketing, design their comms to accommodate that community. And I think accessibility just needs to be woven into that. I think so often we think about who we're targeting, and obviously design features a huge amount into that, but people do forget about that 22% of the population.
Yeah, I think what you said there about razors really, that actually brought me back to something that I remember learning about a few years ago, because I had a lecturer called Malcolm Barnard, and he actually, in one of his books, wrote about that very issue, about the razors, about how with certain brands of razors, as you said, they do pink for women, blue for men, but really it's at the end of the day, it's the same product. And what's happening there is a case of connotation, which is where it's like pink implies female, blue implies male. Yeah. And I think what you said there is very interesting as an example in terms of graphics, in terms of that, but especially is because I'm like, well, what we do here, because we do a lot of like design work, a lot of what I do is graphic design. I'd be interested to know, could you think of any Is there any wider examples as well? So I know I've been talking a lot about, and we've been focusing on colour contrast and things like that, which are all graphic design issues. Could you think of any ways in which brands could be missing out on a wider level, like separate from that, like within a product that you can think of that's inaccessible, or a service?
So of course you have like the visible design, the graphic design, of course. But I think so often we talk about the consumer journey from like start to finish. If that journey itself is not accessible or not inclusive to the community, or quite often you can have perfectly accessible, but it's just not spoken about and they don't know it, they don't show it in their comms, they don't show it represented anywhere. Quite often, then you're missing out on that target audience. If you have, let's say, an app, and that they find it difficult to use the app, like it's not just the UI, it's the user experience that goes entirely throughout the whole thing. So we've spoken about inclusive design. What would your top tips to someone who's thinking about being more inclusive in their design work? Or as a brand, what would your top tips be going forward? Like, what are the first steps?
I think the best thing you can do when it comes to inclusive design is to look out and find out, because there are a lot of great experts who give a lot of great advice on that topic. But also in addition to that, I think the best thing that you can do really when it comes to inclusive design is work with the community that you're looking to engage better with.
And I think that's what we try and do a lot of. Absolutely. 100% agree.
And so that brings us to the end of episode 1. Thank you for joining me, Josie.
Thank you, Luke.
Wow, that was terrible. And so that does it for episode 1 of our section of the podcast. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. I've always wanted to say that. And hit the bell for notifications.
Ring the bell.
If you're listening to us on Spotify, you can follow us.
I really want you to have a YouTube channel now.
That can be arranged. Bye.